I'm here today with Max Cameron. He's the head of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at UBC, and he's also authored a new book. It's about reforming democracies, which are getting out of hand in a lot of places. He's particularly concerned about confronting oligarchies that are arising, which are when a small group is in charge of a nation or a region. Your book is about, right here, it's about developing political wisdom in the public sphere, in politics, political institutions, and practical wisdom. And it doesn't deal too directly with proportional representation, but it's certainly relevant to proportional representation, and that's the big decision that British Columbians have to make in November. And I've been asking questions of Max about his book and how it relates to proportional representation. Yeah, just get you going on that. I really resonate with your concerns about how first past the post, which is the system we have now, gives us false majorities. What do you
Yeah, I think that's true. One of the big criticisms of the first past the post system is that it's relatively easy to construct majority governments based on less than a majority of the popular vote, and this is often referred to as false majority governments.
40% of the vote and you get 100% of the power.
That's right, exactly. And you know, not only is it problematic in the sense that it can create policy lurch between quite different conceptions of politics, but it can also, I think, detract from the quality of governance, and it diminishes the importance of ordinary members of parliament. We have very whipped legislatures. Our parties are very disciplined organizations, and that means that much of the time between elections, the image of the legislator as a trained seal, while it's a bit of an exaggeration, there's some truth to it. And so one of the virtues of creating a system of proportional representation is it would actually make it more difficult to construct these false majorities. You would have to have coalitions and supplying confidence arrangements like we currently have in Victoria between the NDP and the Greens. That would become much more common. I actually think that there's a virtue to this because it actually requires politicians to work together to find common ground, to reach compromises, to try to figure out what's in the public interest, what's going to lead to good government. And over time, as we see, if we look at European democracies, many of which are parliamentary systems based on proportional representation, there's a tendency to construct relatively stable, centrist governing coalitions that have the capacity to get things done, like build strong welfare states or address climate change.
Yeah, and that's built through coalition building, consensus building. I'm sure there's a lot of partisanship in there's about 35 OECD countries that use proportional representation at some point.
Right.
I think most people don't know that.
No,
It's a very common system, maybe even sort of more normal than what we have. But that idea that you can't just be hyper partisan, you have to take seriously your opponents and be ready to work with some of them.
That's right. I mean, parties are an essential ingredient of democracy. I mean, democracy without parties is unthinkable. On the other hand, there's a place for partisanship. You can be too partisan. If you're so partisan that you can't hear what the other side is saying, you can't listen, you're not interested in compromise, and we see that, for example, in the United States. When partisanship becomes negative, it's more about how I disagree with you and want to suppress your vote rather than advocating for my own cause. Yeah. That's too much partisanship. Too little partisanship would be where you don't stand up for what you believe in, you don't fight for what you think is worth fighting for. So it's about finding a balance. And I think our system, because first past the post tends to be polarizing, it tends to create two-party systems with quite antagonistic parties, big tent parties. There's a certain amount of consensus building that goes on inside those parties. But the two parties are often at loggerheads between elections and at election time. Yeah. A more proportional system, and you're right to say, the majority of the high-quality democracies in the world are, in fact, proportional representation, consensus-based parliamentary democracies. In that context, you still have partisanship, but parties know that they have to work together. And I think if you go into an election knowing there's a good chance you're going to have to work with the people you're competing against, you're more likely to tone down the level of partisanship.
Well, I'm really interested in quizzing you about that whole issue of extremism, because that's become probably the major criticism of potential problem with proportional representation that'll give rise to small give too much power to small fringe extremist groups. And you've got some answers to that. One of the things you said is that, regardless of the system, if extremist party's going to rise, it's probably going to rise anyways. And I think you cited Poland and other places.
Yeah, Poland, Hungary, the United States have all seen sort of right-wing governments come to power, populist governments, you could call them, although there are some questions with that terminology. Yeah. But these are very popular political parties that are going to win big majorities in any electoral system.
Right.
So the suggestion that the electoral reform would make that more likely is problematic. And of course, Trump was elected in a first past the post. Yeah. Rob Ford, recently elected in Ontario under first past the post. We're not going to immunize ourselves against that kind of politics. Mm-hmm. The extremist parties, kind of really sort of wacko right-wing, parties, Maoists or neo-Nazis, they don't have much space in any of the political systems in Europe, with the possible exception of Austria. Yeah. And certainly I don't think in BC we've got much of a culture that promotes that. So what we're really looking at are nativist parties. These are sort of parties that are concerned about immigration. They're concerned about the erosion of traditional values, caused by globalization and so forth. Certainly those parties have become more influential in Europe. And, I think the concern of critics is that sometimes smaller parties can have sort of outsized or disproportionate influence within the system.
Blackmail the parties.
Exactly. They're sort of kind of blackmail power because they can determine what coalitions get elected, and so they can sort of drive their agenda forward. That it is true that if you create a party system where there are going to be more parties, and inevitably there are going to be more smaller parties, those are going to have influence, as the Greens currently have a lot of influence in Victoria today.
And you say the Conservatives Party could have more power in BC politics under a proportional representation system, and I think you think that's fine.
Yeah, I personally, believe, to go back to this point about oligarchy, the best way to immunize ourselves against the tendency of power to be really concentrated, particularly economic power to have undue influence, is by having good representation. So, if good representation means you have more parties, more voices, more diversity reflected in the legislature, it's true, some of those voices you and I might not agree with, other people might not agree with. Wherever you stand on the political spectrum, you're going to have more diversity of opinions, and some of that we may not be happy about. But the way to fight people whose views we disagree with is by making the counter arguments, getting out there, campaigning, making the case for immigration or multiculturalism, as the case may be, not to try to prevent it by going for a system of representation that really makes it hard for our parties to reflect the diversity of opinion that we have in our society. Yeah,
and you think, as I do, that Canada is pretty unusual for its level of tolerance of immigration and diversity, and there's polls that show that, and all over the world. I don't think you think there's an extremist party group that's ready to seize power too quickly.
I don't see that. I mean, I think we are, frankly, the most successful multicultural society in the world. We have a higher level of immigration than any other advanced industrial democracy, and we have not had riots. We don't have ghettos. We don't have a major problem. I think that new Canadians are some of the patriotic Canadians you'll find. They embrace the values of tolerance, of diversity, and openness of our society as much or more than traditional Canadians. I really don't think that we're the kind of country where you're going to see that kind of anti-immigrant, hostile sort of to multicultural sort of attitude developing. Although we did see a little bit of that excuse me, in the last election. With some of the more sort of extreme voices within the Conservative Party federally. So there is certainly a part of the electorate that may be open to certain kinds of anti-immigrant or anti-multicultural appeals, but I think it's pretty much a minority. I think it's unlikely that changing our electoral system is going to do anything to facilitate that.
Yeah. As the November referendum starts to get closer, what do you hope British Columbians will be doing?
Well, I think we're going to have a lively debate. I mean, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change our electoral system, to adopt a system that I think would enhance representation, would create a legislature that is more likely to reflect the diversity of the province, to create a context in which politicians will have to work together more collaboratively. We saw in New Zealand, Helen Clark was recently here in Vancouver, and she argued that when New Zealand adopted proportional representation, she saw a change in the political culture.
That's the former Prime Minister.
The former Prime Minister of New Zealand. They've seen very successful coalition governments. We've seen historically in Canada, coalitions can be very successful. Minority governments are very responsive to the electorate. They tend to be, for obvious reasons. Pearson had a minority government in the 1960s, brought us a number of important changes, including our flag, multiculturalism, pension plan.
Yeah.
So I think we have an opportunity to be one of the jurisdictions in North America. There are others, by the way, in the United States, like Maine adopted STV recently. We can be one of those jurisdictions that begins to pioneer changes in the electoral system that could lead to improvements. And by the way, I think that there's been a certain amount of criticism of a couple of the proposals that will be on the ballot. One is the rural-urban PR, and the other is dual-member proportional systems because they haven't been tried elsewhere. The reality is one of them is a mix of STV and MMP, and those are systems that are well known. The dual-member proportional really is innovative, but of the various systems, it's one that requires relatively little engineering or re-engineering, particularly of our electoral boundaries. So I think that if you look at the European systems of PR, they have list PR in many cases. There are some problems with how that would work in our region. I think we should embrace the idea that we might be a place that would try to find a system that's actually tailored to our geography, to our politics, and to our culture. And I think, frankly, any of the three systems would be fine. But I think it's actually quite wonderful that we potentially could be an innovator and set the tone for other jurisdictions in the country.
Thanks very much, Max. I'm sort of hoping that British Columbians will kind of not be too fearful and will kind of open their minds to being innovators. Why not? If it can't happen here,
let's hope
might not happen.
We're the West Coast, right?
Yeah, we're supposed to be innovators. I really appreciate your thoughts on proportional representation and politics, and I really enjoyed reading the book. It's, as I say, not directly related to proportional representation, but every theme you cover does get into the values associated with electoral reform.
Well, thanks so much, Doug, for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Good.